You know, in the world of true crime, there's really nothing more chilling than a story that just stops. A story with no ending. Today we're talking about the real ghost of the justice system, serial killers who did the unthinkable and then just, poof, vanished, never to face a final day in court.
It's the big question, right? The one that keeps you up at night. How on earth does a person who commits these kinds of crimes just disappear into thin air? Are they just that smart? Is the system that broken? Or is it something else? Well, as we're about to see, it's usually a pretty disturbing mix of all of the above. Let's get into it.
So we're going to break this down by looking at three totally different cases. We've got one killer who basically slipped through the cracks of international law. Then we have another who loved to taunt the police with these bizarre intellectual games. And finally, a third who was in a way protected by the prejudices of his own time. Okay, first up is Pedro López. And his story is, well, it's just a terrifying example of total systemic failure. This isn't a guy who escaped once. He was practically handed his freedom over and over again by multiple countries.
300. That's how many murders Pedro López claimed he committed across South America. He actually called himself the man of the century. I mean, the nerve. But you know what's even crazier? It's how the justice system itself pretty much helped him get away with it all.
Just look at this timeline. It's an absolutely shocking pattern of failure. So in Peru, he gets caught red-handed. But what does the authorities do? They just deport him. No charges. He lands in Ecuador, where he's finally convicted for 57 murders. But the max sentence there is only 16 years. 16! He even gets out early for good behavior and gets sent back to Colombia. And then, the final unbelievable step. He's declared sane and released on about $70 bail. And he's gone. Never seen again. At every single one of these points, he could have been stopped for good. And at every single point, the system just let him walk right through.
All right, let's move on to our next case. This is the Freeway Phantom, who was terrorizing Washington, D.C. back in the early 70s. Now, this wasn't a story about messed up bureaucracy. This was about a killer who played this chilling, super frustrating mind game with the police, leaving clues that were just as maddening as they were revealing.
So the Phantom set up this terrifying pattern right from the jump. The first victim, a 13-year-old girl, was found by the highway. The second victim, found just 15 feet away from the first. But here's the detail that really gives you the chills. In both cases, the girl's shoes were gone. That became his signature, his awful calling card.
And then he left this. He put a note in the pocket of his fourth victim, a note he wrote on a page he tore from her own school notebook. He was talking right to the police, just taunting them. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can. I mean, that is just pure, chilling arrogance. And this whole note, this whole taunt, it all came down to one single word: tantamount. Think about it. That's a pretty formal, kind of unusual word to use, right? It ended up being the single biggest clue the detectives had. Years later, it actually pointed them to a suspect, a guy who was known for using that exact word and who'd been a patient at a hospital right next to where the first body was found. But they had no physical evidence, so he was never charged. And just like that, the case went cold. Okay, for our last case, we're heading to 1970s San Francisco to talk about a killer known only as the Doodler. Now, this guy didn't get away because of legal loopholes or clever games. No, he was shielded by something way more insidious: the fear and prejudice that was just baked into society at the time. So this was the Doodler's MO, his method. It was unique. He would go into gay bars and approach men, not with aggression, but with art. He'd sketch their portrait on a napkin, use it to strike up a conversation, and then lure them away. Later, his victims would be found brutally murdered. It was just this chillingly intimate, incredibly deceptive way to operate. And here's where the story just gets absolutely tragic. The police actually had a suspect, a man who was positively identified by 3 different survivors of his attacks. So that's the big question, isn't it? Why did he get away? Why wasn't this case ever closed? Well, the answer really lies in the intense homophobia of the 1970s. For these survivors, going to court and testifying meant they would have to publicly out themselves as gay. And back then, this wasn't just about privacy. It could literally end your career, destroy your reputation, ruin your life. One of the survivors was a famous entertainer. Another was a foreign diplomat. They were stuck with this impossible choice: get justice for their attacker or protect their entire lives from being torn apart. They chose to stay silent. And without their testimony, the prosecutors had nothing. The case fell apart.
So when you step back and look at these three cases, the monster, the phantom, and the doodler, you start to see a bigger picture form, a picture of exactly how and why the worst people among us sometimes just get away.
See, it's never just one simple thing. Pedro López walked free because of broken international laws and shockingly light sentences. The Freeway phantom disappeared behind a smokescreen of mind games and frustrating dead ends. And the doodler was protected by a society that literally made his victims too scared to speak up. They're ghosts now, but they were created by very real, very human failures.
And that, of course, leaves us with the most unsettling question of all. These are just three of the famous cases. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other killers have slipped through these exact same cracks? How many more could be out there right now, hiding, not in the shadows, but right out in plain sight?